The room always changes when a liar walks in, not because of what they say, but because of what your body quietly feels before your mind catches up. You've probably experienced it before. Someone smiled at you while hiding resentment behind their teeth. Someone promised loyalty while already planning their betrayal. Someone looked straight into your eyes and calmly twisted reality without a hint of guilt. And the terrifying part is this: most liars don't look nervous. They look calm, friendly, confident, even trustworthy. That's why deception is dangerous, because the people who hurt you the most rarely arrive looking like villains. They arrive looking safe. Some lies only waste your time. Others slowly destroy your confidence, your peace, and your ability to trust yourself. And the worst victims are often good people, honest people, empathetic people. The kind of people who keep giving chances because they want to believe there's goodness in everyone. But the truth always leaks somewhere. No matter how polished someone sounds, the human mind struggles to fully hide deception. Tiny cracks appear in behavior, emotions, reactions, and energy. Most people simply never learn to notice them. Once you do, conversations start looking completely different. You stop listening only to words. You start observing patterns, timing, emotion, contradictions, and suddenly people become much easier to read, because lies don't just come from the mouth, they leak through the entire person. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming liars always look nervous. Experienced liars know exactly what people expect. They know everyone watches for shaky voices, avoiding eye contact, awkward behavior. So instead of looking guilty, they become overly controlled, too calm, too smooth, too prepared. Their answers arrive too quickly, almost like they rehearsed them beforehand. Their eye contact feels forced, like they're trying to prove innocence instead of naturally existing in the conversation. And slowly, something starts feeling strange, not wrong enough to immediately expose them, but unnatural enough to make your instincts uncomfortable. That feeling matters, because real emotions are messy, real memories are imperfect. Honest people pause sometimes, they forget details, they correct themselves naturally. But liars often perform emotions instead of genuinely feeling them. You can see it when someone reacts too perfectly. The apology sounds polished, the sadness sounds theatrical, the outrage arrives a second too fast. It feels more like acting than honesty, and your nervous system notices this before your logical mind does. That's why some people leave conversations feeling exhausted without understanding why. Their body detected tension while their mind kept trying to stay polite. Manipulators rely on this politeness. They know most people ignore their instincts because they don't want to seem dramatic or paranoid. So the liar keeps performing and the victim keeps doubting themselves. But the moment someone starts looking too perfect during serious conversations, pay attention. Truth usually relaxes, performance usually controls itself, and there's a massive difference between the two. Truth rarely panics, lies do. One of the clearest, most undeniable signs of profound deception is when a simple, everyday question suddenly creates absolute emotional chaos and explosive defensiveness. You ask something completely normal, calm, and reasonable, expecting a direct answer, But instead of getting clarity, you immediately get intense irritation, deflection, and unprovoked anger. They look at you with artificial outrage and say, "Why are you attacking me?" Or, "So now you do not trust me?" Or, "You always overthink everything and ruin our peace." Notice what just happened in that precise moment. Instead of answering the clear question that was asked, they turned the spotlight completely onto you, changing the subject entirely. This is classic psychological redirection, because if they can make you feel guilty enough for asking questions, you will stop asking them out of discomfort. And many people do exactly that because they want to avoid a massive, exhausting conflict. Especially empathetic people. Empathetic people naturally hate making others uncomfortable or sad. The exact second someone acts deeply offended or hurt, they begin apologizing and backing down, even when their initial concerns were completely valid and reasonable. Manipulators understand this deep emotional vulnerability and they exploit it. That is why some people weaponize extreme emotion instead of giving honest, straightforward answers to simple questions. They know emotional confusion weakens your ability to think clearly, leaving you vulnerable. Suddenly, the conversation is not about their suspicious behavior or their broken promises anymore. Now, the conversation is entirely about your trust issues, your unreasonable jealousy, or your negative energy. And if you are not careful, you leave that conversation feeling incredibly guilty, while the liar escapes accountability completely and safely. This dynamic becomes even more dangerous in romantic relationships because love can blind people to patterns they would instantly recognize in strangers without a second thought. Someone lies repeatedly about small and large things. They break promises repeatedly without a hint of genuine remorse. They act suspicious repeatedly and hide their phone. But every time they get confronted, they create enough emotional drama, shouting and tears to avoid taking responsibility. And eventually, after months or years of this psychological warfare, the victim becomes completely emotionally exhausted and drained. That is the true hidden goal of many manipulators, which is not convincing you they are innocent, but exhausting you until you completely stop questioning them out of pure survival. Because tired people are much easier to control, manipulate, and keep in the dark. They want to wear down your psychological defenses until you accept their fabricated reality over your own eyesight and instincts. When you ask for the truth and receive a storm of anger, it is a sign that they are desperate to hide what lies beneath. Honest people do not need to attack your character to prove their innocence. They simply state the facts. But a liar must destroy your confidence so that you never dare to look closely at the cracks in their stories. They rely on your politeness and your self-doubt to keep their illusions alive. The moment you recognize this pattern of dramatic redirection, the manipulation loses its power over you. You stop defending yourself against their false accusations and remain firmly focused on the unanswered question. True clarity does not require emotional manipulation, shouting, or guilt trips. It only requires honesty, which a liar can never truly give you.
Most people think liars avoid details. Actually, many liars do the exact opposite. They overload conversations with unnecessary information because they believe detailed stories sound more believable. So instead of giving a simple explanation, they create entire scenes. They mention exact times nobody asked for, tiny random details, long explanations, names, places, background events. At first it sounds convincing, but after a while it starts feeling strange, because honest people usually focus on what mattered emotionally. Liars focus on sounding credible. They build stories instead of recalling memories. And the problem with invented stories is this: they require maintenance. Truth is easy to remember because it actually happened. Lies require constant mental effort. A liar has to remember which version they told, to who and when. That's why contradictions eventually appear. Tiny details change, timelines shift, reactions stop matching previous statements. And when those inconsistencies appear, liars often become even more dramatic to distract from them. That's another important thing to understand. Manipulative people often use intensity to overpower logic. If they talk fast enough, react emotionally enough, or create enough confusion, they hope you'll stop calmly observing the situation. And unfortunately, many people do, because clarity requires emotional distance. That's why calm observation is so powerful. The calmer you stay, the easier it becomes to notice patterns, and patterns rarely lie. Words can, emotions can, performances can, but repeated patterns always reveal the truth eventually. This psychological phenomenon explains why detecting deception requires looking past the surface of words and analyzing the structural design of the narrative being presented to you. When a person is operating from a place of dishonesty, their main objective is not connection, but survival within the conversation, which forces them to overcompensate by constructing an ironclad fortress of facts that ultimately serves as their own trap. They firmly believe that if they provide enough external evidence, exact sequences of trivial movements, or historical context that has absolutely no bearing on the core issue, you'll be too overwhelmed to question their integrity. They mistake complexity for authenticity, failing to realize that human memory is naturally selective, porous, and anchored in subjective perception rather than an objective minute-by-minute ledger of events. An honest individual recounting an experience will naturally filter out the irrelevant noise, focusing instead on how they felt, what surprised them, or the primary consequence of the event, often admitting gaps in their recollection because they have no underlying anxiety about being disbelieved. Conversely, the deceptive mind views every unanswered detail as a potential vulnerability that could expose their fabrication, driving them to preemptively fill every silence with meticulously manufactured data. This constant state of hypervigilance places an immense cognitive load on the liar, as they are not merely retrieving a static file from their memory banks, but are actively writing, editing, and performing a script in real time, while simultaneously monitoring your facial expressions for signs of skepticism. This cognitive exhaustion is precisely why the narrative inevitably begins to fracture over time, as maintaining the internal consistency of an unearned reality becomes mathematically impossible when subjected to repeated exposure or subsequent discussions. The timeline that was once so precisely stated suddenly shifts by several hours, the peripheral characters in the story change their roles, and the emotional responses they display cease to align with the gravity of the situation they are describing. When these structural cracks finally appear and they realize their intellectual manipulation is failing, they pivot from informational overload to emotional intensity, using dramatic escalation as a smokescreen to blind your analytical faculties. They will purposely introduce chaos, rapid speech, aggressive defensiveness, or deep theatrical hurt to force you into an emotional reaction, knowing that the moment you become angry, defensive, or guilt-ridden, your capacity for critical observation drops significantly, allowing them to escape the spotlight of truth.
Surviving this psychological warfare requires you to refuse to participate in the artificial storm they are generating, remaining deeply grounded in your own calm, detached perspective. By preserving your emotional distance and refusing to be distracted by their loud performances, you gain the clarity necessary to see past the immediate words and trace the broader, unchanging architecture of their behavior. A liar can rehearse a single conversation perfectly, but they can never rehearse a lifestyle of honesty, meaning their underlying patterns will always eventually rise to the surface and tell the true story they are trying so desperately to hide.
Honest conversations usually create clarity. Manipulation creates fog. This is one of the most overlooked signs of deception. You leave the conversation feeling mentally drained, confused, anxious, or strangely guilty, even though the original issue was simple. Why? Because manipulators survive through confusion. They change topics constantly, bring up unrelated problems, twist your words, interrupt explanations, turn themselves into the victim, create emotional chaos. And the more confused you become, the more control they gain. Some people lie so often that confusion becomes part of their communication style. Nothing feels direct, nothing feels stable, everything feels emotionally slippery. And over time, the victim starts questioning their own perception. Maybe I'm overthinking, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I'm the problem. That self-doubt is exactly where manipulators want you, because once someone no longer trusts their own instincts, they become emotionally dependent on external validation. That's real psychological control. And this is why emotionally calm people are difficult to manipulate, because calm people don't rush to defend themselves emotionally. They observe, they listen carefully, they notice inconsistencies without immediately reacting, and liars hate that. A manipulator wants emotional movement. They want panic, anger, guilt, confusion, anything that prevents clear observation. But silence is dangerous for them. Stillness exposes cracks. You'll notice this if you calmly repeat the same question during a suspicious conversation. Instead of getting clearer answers, the liar often becomes increasingly uncomfortable because deception struggles under calm pressure. Truth usually becomes clearer with time. Lies usually become messier. Never forget that difference. This deliberate tactic of generating intellectual and emotional fog serves as a protective shield for the deceptive individual, because as long as the parameters of the discussion remain unstructured and chaotic, accountability becomes impossible to enforce. In a healthy dynamic, two individuals communicate to bridge the gap of misunderstanding, bringing hidden facts into the light so that both parties can operate from a shared reality. A manipulator, however, views clarity as an absolute threat to their survival within the relationship, meaning their primary objective is to fracture your sense of certainty until you lack the confidence to hold them responsible for their actions. They deliberately deploy cognitive dissonance as a tool, weaving a complex web of half-truths, historical grievances, and projection that leaves your mind spinning in circles, trying to untangle the irrelevant details they throw into the conversation. When you confront them with a specific, undeniable piece of evidence regarding their behavior, they do not address the evidence. Instead, they immediately shift the focus to an error you made months ago, completely changing the trajectory of the dialogue.
This constant shifting of the goalposts ensures that you are always on the defensive, forced to justify your character, your tone, or your timing, rather than investigating their actual deception. Over days, months, or years of experiencing this slippery communication style, your psychological stamina begins to erode significantly, leading to a state of chronic self-doubt where you find yourself constantly second-guessing your own memory, eyesight, and sanity. You begin to internalize their false narratives, wondering if your reasonable boundaries are actually signs of paranoia, or if your desire for honesty is somehow a symptom of being too demanding or emotionally unstable. This psychological wear and tear is precisely what the deceptive person relies on, because once your internal compass is completely broken, you lose the ability to stand firmly in your truth, effectively surrendering all your emotional autonomy to their control. The only antidote to this exhausting cycle of confusion is to anchor yourself in absolute emotional stillness and refuse to chase the erratic conversational tangents they create to distract you. When you cease reacting to their theatrical outrage, their false victimhood, or their projected guilt, you strip them of the emotional fuel required to sustain the illusion. By maintaining a calm, unshakable presence and persistently returning the focus to the original unanswered question, you force the deception out into the open where it cannot survive. A liar relies on your chaotic emotional participation to hide the glaring structural contradictions in their narrative, but when met with absolute calm, their performance quickly unravels under its own weight. True clarity requires no defense, no elaborate justifications, and no psychological warfare. It simply stands on its own, while the manufactured fog of a manipulator will always dissipate when confronted by steady, patient observation.
This might be the darkest sign of all. The most dangerous liars don't deceive randomly. They customize their deception around your emotional weaknesses. If you fear abandonment, they promise forever. If you crave validation, they praise you constantly. If you feel lonely, they make you feel deeply understood. At first, it feels incredible, like someone finally sees you completely. But what's really happening is emotional targeting. Manipulative people pay close attention to insecurities because insecurities create access points. And the sad truth is this: many victims mistake emotional intensity for genuine connection. Someone says all the right things, gives attention at the perfect moments, creates powerful emotional highs, makes you feel chosen. But eventually, the mask slips, because real love creates peace. Manipulation creates dependency. There's always instability beneath deception, anxiety, uncertainty, emotional inconsistency, and deep down, most victims feel this long before they consciously admit it. The problem is emotional attachment. People often stay attached to potential instead of reality. They remember who someone seemed to be in the beginning and ignore who they consistently become over time. But patterns matter more than promises, always. Someone can apologize beautifully and still continue hurting you. Someone can speak softly while manipulating you constantly.
Someone can say, "Trust me," while actively destroying your ability to trust yourself. That's why self-awareness is protection. The more emotionally aware you become, the harder it is for deceptive people to control you, because manipulators depend on emotional blindness. They need you disconnected from your instincts. But once you trust your perception again, everything changes. You stop chasing explanations. You stop ignoring red flags. You stop confusing charm with character. And suddenly, deceptive people lose power over you. This dark art of psychological exploitation relies heavily on the manipulator's ability to map out your inner landscape and identify the hidden fractures within your self-esteem, turning your deepest human desires into weapons used against you. When an individual lacks a solid sense of self-worth or carries unhealed childhood wounds, they naturally project their unmet needs onto the people they meet, inadvertently broadcasting exactly how they can be deceived. Highly skilled manipulators scan for these signals with predatory precision, offering an engineered persona that feels like a custom-made antidote to your pain. This initial phase of intense adoration and profound validation is designed to dismantle your emotional boundaries completely, lowering your natural defenses so that the deceiver can establish deep roots inside your life. Because the emotional highs are so intoxicating, your brain associates this person with ultimate safety and happiness, which makes it incredibly difficult to think objectively when their behavior inevitably shifts toward control, cruelty, or cold indifference. The tragic consequence of this dynamic is that the victim becomes thoroughly conditioned to chase the ghost of the perfect beginning, constantly forgiving blatant disrespect because they desperately want to recapture that initial feeling of being deeply seen and uniquely cherished. They find themselves trapped in an exhausting cycle of cognitive dissonance, making endless excuses for the manipulator's current toxic actions by contrasting them with their past beautiful words. This artificial bond is intentionally unstable, as the deceiver uses periodic reinforcement, withdrawing affection and then offering it back just as you are about to walk away, keeping you in a permanent state of anxiety and hypervigilance. Over time, this emotional instability completely shatters your relationship with your own intuition, leading you to trust the liar's deceptive statements over the objective evidence of your own physical senses and suffering. Breaking free from this profound psychological trap requires an absolute commitment to radically observing reality as it is, rather than how you wish it could be. Reclaiming your personal power begins when you stop listening to empty declarations of love and start measuring a person's character strictly through the lens of their long-term, daily behavioral patterns. When you heal your own insecurities and learn to provide yourself with the validation and security you once sought from others, you close the emotional access points that predators use to infiltrate your life. A manipulator's words can be beautifully polished, but their actions will always expose the truth of their intent if you possess the courage to look at them clearly.
by developing an unshakable trust in your own perception and refusing to compromise your peace for the sake of an artificial connection. You build an invisible fortress around your heart that no amount of superficial charm, false promises, or calculated flattery can ever penetrate.
One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that not everyone who smiles at you is honest with you. Some people study trust only to exploit it. Some people learn kindness only to imitate it. Some people become experts at saying exactly what others want to hear. But no lie survives forever. Eventually, the mask slips. Eventually, the patterns repeat too many times. Eventually, the truth leaks through the cracks. And when that moment comes, the most important thing is this: don't ignore what you see just because accepting it hurts. Because people who genuinely care about you do not leave you drowning in confusion. They don't constantly make you question your instincts, your memory, or your worth. Real honesty creates clarity. Real connection creates peace. Real people don't need endless performances to feel trustworthy. So start paying attention, not only to words, but to consistency, energy, and patterns. Your instincts notice far more than you think. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly walk away from someone whose truth never feels real.